Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled Cash Reserves, Why You Need Them and How to Build Them. Today's webinar is presented by Evangelical Christian Credit Union. My name is David Lee, one of the presenters as well as the moderator. I'm a Ministry Development Officer here at ECCU, and I'll be introducing our other presenters here in a moment. But first, let's find out who's registered for this webinar. We actually have close to about 240 attendees for this webinar, coming from 37 states across here in the United States. And we especially would like to welcome our 4 countries, international presence, Quebec, Nigeria, South Africa, and Germany. So welcome. Don't know what time it is out there, but we're so delighted that you took the time to join us. The ministries that are actually represented in this webinar, we took a look at some of the statistics here. It looks like the revenues, they represent ministries that have revenues ranging from $20,000 up to $56 million. And so one thing that I'm concluding is that regardless of the size of your ministry that you represent, cash reserves continues to be an issue and something of a hot topic. The ministries that are represented in terms of the churches, Christian schools, and the mission sending agencies represented here are 69% are actually represented by churches. Parachurch organizations would represent about 24%, and the remaining with the mission sending agencies and the Christian schools. Well, whatever your ministry and wherever you may be ministering in, we want to thank you for joining us. Now, during today's presentation, you'll be able to participate in a couple of ways, and one's by submitting questions. And do that at any time on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be answering questions towards the end of the presentation, and most likely we're not going to be able to get to every question, but we'll try to hit as many as we can. And along the way, in terms of the presentation, we'll also be asking you some poll questions along the way for you to actively participate. And so you'll know this webinar is being recorded, and in a few days, each of you will be receiving an email with a link to the recording and some additional resources. Now, some of the things we hope to touch base on and what we'll be discussing is, first is talking about what constitutes the reserves and why they're so important for every ministry. Another idea that we're hoping to touch base on is talking about the process a ministry goes through in setting various cash reserve targets. Also hope to touch and talk about the struggles and the benefits I think all of us as ministries we've experienced as we try to work to achieve our cash reserve goals. And then last, we're going to be talking actually with an ECCU member as they try to build and manage their own cash reserves. And so let's go right into actually our, I'd like to introduce our presenters. And again, as I said, my name is David Lee. I'm the first presenter here, and I'll be talking about building the case of why you need to build them. I've been with the credit union for the past 20 years. Also have the opportunity to be able to be bivocational and serving on the pastoral staff at my local Denver church here for the last 20 years as well. And so delighted to be here and coming alongside you and trying to equip you. Coming alongside also is our other panel of experts and presenters, Jim Clark, who's the pastor of business and stewardship at First EV Free Church of Fullerton, California. He leads the areas of finance, human resources, information systems, campus operations, risk management, and stewardship education. Jim's passionate about leadership and organizational development, and Jim holds a bachelor's and master's degree in organizational leadership from Biola University. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, David. It's great to be with you.
And second, we have Mark Jones. Mark is a vice president and senior banking consultant with ECCU, and he's worked in banking for over 25 years. And he's taught nationally and written extensively on topics related to nonprofit financial management and banking. Mark has served on the governing board of his church as elder, treasurer, and currently works as the finance director. And he's also served on several nonprofit boards. Good morning, Mark.
Hey, good morning, David. Great to be here today.
Well, we're going to do what we can to try to equip each and every one of you, and let's dive right into with the first poll question that we have. I'd like to ask your ministry the question, does your ministry currently have cash reserves? Pretty simple, yes or no. You have to pause on that, a little concerned, but do you or do you not? So let's take a couple of seconds for you to go ahead and respond to that. While we're waiting for some of the results, we'd also like to welcome our satellite and our simulcast. This webinar is being broadcasted in 3 other locations in North Los Angeles with a group of ministries there, in Central Orange County, and also in Texas. So we'd like to welcome them. Well, let's see what the results of this poll looks like. So this is very encouraging. 78% of those that are polled here on this webinar, 78% having cash reserves. I think the big question is how much now. 22% ministries, obviously with the desire, how do we get there and how do we go through a process to make sure that we actually build up those cash reserves. So hopefully we'll be able to address and address some of the questions that both of these those that have cash reserves and those that don't will be able to address some of those concerns. Well, let's begin and dive right into building the case of why you need them. I think the first question we have to begin talking about is what is liquidity? And the best way to describe liquidity from our perspective is it's truly the available cash and other resources which can be turned into cash fairly quickly, and that's talking about probably within 30 days you'll be able to have cash readily available. But I think another way of defining truly what cash is defining it by saying what it isn't. And what cash reserve or liquidity isn't are restricted funds. And so what I mean by that is if you have funds that have been donations that have been given to you by donors or your congregation members, and they've restricted it. So it's a donor restricted gift. Those would not be considered part of the liquidity calculation or the cash reserve calculation. If it is cash restricted or designated by the board, but it was unrestricted by the donor, those could be considered as part of the calculation in that cash reserve. What it also isn't is it is not the replacement reserve funds that you as a ministry have set aside for capital items. A simple example would be like an HVAC system. You set it aside for HVAC to eventually replace it. If that's the case, we would say that that is not part of the calculation for cash reserves. And then what it also is not are prepaid revenue for future expenses. And the best example would be prepaid tuition. For obviously with the school year recently ending for the Christian schools that are represented here, many parents have already prepaid for their upcoming 2012 and 2013 school year. If they've paid the tuition up front already and that's been set aside, that is not part of the calculation that we take into consideration for cash reserves. And let me ask, actually, from the ministry standpoint, Pastor Jim, when you begin thinking about this whole idea and concept of liquidity, what does that mean to you for your ministry there?
Well, for me, David, it means it's cash that's available. It's not something that we have to go searching for, looking for, or finding ways to save from our budget. It's money that's available. It's there for emergencies. It's those savings that we need to have. And that comes right from Scripture. It's Proverbs 21:20 that says, "In the house of the wise are stores of choice food and oil, but foolish men devour all they have." And it brings me back to thinking about Joseph in Genesis 41, where we gathered for 7 years knowing that a famine was going to come. We all know we're going to have needs, and we have to have the liquid funds available to be able to address those needs when they happen.
You know, I think about kind of those 7 years of famine. I wonder if we knew, if every one of us knew actually that this economic crisis was going to come in 2008, I wonder how we would have responded. I wonder if we would have set aside some more cash reserves for these kinds of times. And I think when we begin thinking about the economy, I think the word that comes up is uncertainty. We frankly don't know, and I think none of us know, and that's why we leave it to God. But there was a poll that was done towards the end of 2011 and also in 2010 where CNBC All-America Economic Survey asked just America, well, what do you think about the economy? Is it better, is it the same, or is it worse, or is it not sure? And you'll see there's about a third across the board. Back in 2010, 37% thought that it was a better year than the previous year. Well, in 2011, that number has dropped significantly by 7%, down to 30%. So I think there's still this sense of uncertainty. We don't know. And obviously with today being an election year this year, I think there's even more uncertainty. to what lies ahead. I think that's part of the reason why we need to continue to rely upon the one who actually knows exactly when this recession is eventually going to end. But the reality is we live in this time of uncertainty. But even also in the church, and this was a study done by Brian Kluth out here in Colorado. He's with Maximum Generosity, and this was a study done in 2012. Again, with the 69% represented in this webinar by churches, this may hit home for you. This was a survey done by 1,360 churches in 2011, and the question was, boy, is your giving going up or is it going down? And again, it continues to be, I think, a very challenging time, 38%, 39, and 32, where they are feeling that the giving continues to go down. There's some light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, 51%, it continues to be better, where giving is going up. And so I would hope and pray that there is some turnaround there. But as giving continues to go up, what are we doing? Are we simply just increasing expenses relative to the increase in giving? Or are we being a little bit more diligent in preparing to set aside some cash reserves? So it's still also hitting the local church as well and the nonprofit organizations. But I think we also do need to take a look at the for-profit and the business world as well. This was a recent statistic done as of 12/31/2011, taking a look at a U.S. Federal Reserve study on U.S. corporate cash as of just this last calendar year. And what you'll find very surprising is I want you to take a look at the acceleration, the rate of acceleration of U.S. corporate cash building up. Essentially, the business world understands the uncertainties of what still lies ahead. And the rate of acceleration is quite staggering as opposed to the time period between 2000 and 2008. And so the business world, they are building up. Some of us may consider that to be hoarding, but these are businesses that have a lot at stake. But I would argue that us as ministries represented, we have much more at stake, something that is of eternal value. And so we want to continue to go back and forth between the business world, what they're doing and what are the good practices, and bring it back into the ministry world. So let's go back into the ministry world. This was a quote actually from Bill Hybels, an excerpt from his book, Axiom. What was interesting is, I don't know if this was intentional by the publishers to identify it as Chapter 11, either Chapter 11 or Chapter 7 related to bankruptcy, but I hope not. In any case, he speaks on this idea here. The painful truth is that unless we become consistently profitable, and I think for many of us represented here as nonprofit organizations, to bring the word profitable into a nonprofit organization makes us a little bit uneasy. But he also contextualizes it by saying, I highlighted in yellow, Willow doesn't try to spend everything it gets. And I think that's some of the tension that Mark, a little bit later on, will kind of talk about in terms of this faith and finances. But Willow, again, they try not to spend everything that it gets, and it sets some dollars aside in an emergency fund to deal with the unexpected expenses. Let me ask you, Jim, again, you live in this ministry world. How does this whole quote of what Pastor Bill speaks on, how does this resonate with your ministry there at First Stevie Free?
Well, it resonates very clearly. You know, emergencies happen. And while we don't like to use the word profitable in the ministry context, generally we find nice church words to use like surplus cash and things like that.
Yeah.
We know that the emergencies are going to come, and we don't want to let whatever that emergency is, that crisis that happens in our ministry, become a financial crisis as well.
Yeah, and I think that the word that keeps coming to mind as you speak on that, Jim, is surprises. We know that in the ministry world there will always be surprises, and surprises that we just will never be able to predict. And so to be ready for something like that, absolutely, that helps us be better prepared. Well, you know, there definitely are some risks associated. What we believe as a credit union, I think of not having sufficient reserves. We identified 5 of them, and I'm sure there are many, many more. But these are the 5 that continues to come to the top of the surface for us. We've seen this. One of it has to do with reducing or eliminating ministry programs. If you don't have the funds available to offset some of the decrease in giving, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. And so we have seen many, many ministries having to reduce and make the difficult decision of eliminating ministry programs. The other one I think hits a little bit more home, and we'll have Jim speak on this a little bit, but it talks about reducing and enforcing cuts in staff in operations and also in ministry, and that's very, very painful, I think, for a lot of ministries. The third, talking about, I like to describe it as financial margin, to not have this breathing room to endure the uncertainties in the giving in the ministry. And again, the uncertainties, the surprises, we will, as good as we are and we try to be diligent in budgeting, we'll never be able to hit it right on. And so to have cash reserve set aside to be able to buffer some of that. The other thing is it could be in violation of your loan covenant. So those of you who actually do have debt today, I would strongly, strongly encourage you, read through what you signed, read through the loan covenants, and there are some requirements that your lender may have built into that loan document that says you need to have and demonstrate X amount of cash, whether in the form of percentages or whether in the form of a specific dollar amount. You need to be prepared to demonstrate that to your lender. Otherwise, that will trigger some default kinds of actions. So that's what not having an adequate reserve could pose as a risk. And I think one of the more painful ones is it shifts, and I've heard this many times again, ministries go from no longer being missional and mission-driven to now being more survival mode. But let's go back into, I think, one of the more painful ones, the second one, forcing cuts in staff. Jim, you've probably had to go through some of these conversations in your ministry. Talk a little bit about maybe some of the deeper implications beyond just cutting staff.
Well, I think one of the things to remember is that any time that you're forced to make cuts in staff, that they're not just financial decisions, they're relational decisions. People are the tools that we use to accomplish ministry. And so they're painful throughout your organization. These are people who have become part of our family. They're part of our church. Their wives may be sitting next to yours at a Bible study. Their children may be your children's friends from Mother's Day Out programs. Layoffs have a set of tone that have ripple effects that go throughout the entire organization. And there's also, even to the best intent of people in our pews, there's a gossip effect. People always want to know, well, what's a real story behind a layoff? Why was that person chosen? And everybody has their own opinion because each person values an individual ministry. And so when they value that ministry, those kind of decisions don't always make sense to them.
No, definitely, it's not the most easiest decisions, but I think what you bring up, Jim, is a great reminder for all of us. We are in the people business. It's about the relationships that God has entrusted to each and every one of us, and so we have to take those very, very seriously. But albeit it's not the easiest decision. So let's from the ministry world, let's go back now into the business world. One of the individuals out there, Warren Buffett, I'm sure everybody knows, recently named the third richest person in the world. And one of the things that he wrote to in his 2010 shareholder letter, I understand that he actually writes this on an annual basis for his company, and it's interesting, his comment. You would think he would have enough, but he says, having loads of liquidity, though, lets us sleep well. And I would venture to say that there's a lot of us here in this webinar who have not gotten as well of sleep. Because we just didn't know what was lying next in terms of the income and whether that major donation was going to come. But he also talks about this, I like the word he plays on it, it talks about playing offense while others are scrambling for survival. So when you think of offense, and Jim, again, I'm going to take it back into the ministry world because that's the world we're living in. What does that word convey to your ministry there at the church, playing offense?
Well, I think of that term offense, and part of what we need to do is to be very aware of who our opponents are. That would include like the economy. We want to know which directions those things potentially be going. I know that can be tricky when financial chaos seems to erupt in different directions every day. But we really do need to be aware of the trends that are out there economically, globally, locally. We need to be on top of the financial data in our church. Because we don't want to be speculating out there. We want to be completely prepared and not speculating.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I could tell you time and time again of ministries that actually have thought that they could double their money in the stock market, and unfortunately, it's been quite some difficult conversations that I know ministries have had. But great perspective. Well, ECCU was about trying to get some information and data to help provide some perspective. And so this is a study that we did actually back in 2010. And we wanted to ask our ministry advisory panel and said, from a cash reserve goal perspective, what do you plan for as a percentage of operating budget year after year? What do you try to plan for? And these intentions are great because ministries, we see the highest percentage, 40% saying, yeah, we want to try to set aside maybe about 3 to 5 months. Jim, at the church, I got to believe that you guys probably set some kind of annual goals. Do you go through that in a regular process?
Absolutely. We begin several months before we select our budget and income targets for the coming year. We go back and look at 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, and even 10-year historical giving trends, spending trends. We do cash flow planning over a 12-month period and project those forward and get the best averages to be able to determine where we need to be on our reserves.
Well, looking back in historical actually is probably one of the best indicators of what's to come, and try to plan for that. Well, from this survey that we conducted, the response was the intentions were great, but later on we discovered that 20% of those respondents actually had no reserves. So again, intentions are great, but you have to have plans and actionable steps to be able to reach that goal. And surprisingly, of that 20% that didn't have reserves, 43% were actually identified as parachurch organizations. Here's another startling statistic, and we don't have the recent one of 2011, but as of 2010, Barna said that 75 churches close every week in the United States. And so our intention and desire from this webinar is, what do we do to equip our ministry so that this statistic goes down and disappears? Because we need our churches in the communities that you're serving. Our communities need you. Again, ECCU is all about just trying to get our arms around what are the indicators, and so we take a look at a lot of financial statements, not only of ECCU members, but we also take a look at those of potential members who are saying, hey, help us understand whether you think we're financially healthy or not. So we've taken a look at a lot of financial statements, and the number one correlation that we came out to, the result was, the top correlation we found was the percentage of cash to income related to financially distressed ministries. And we identified that 92% of ministries with 14% or equivalent to 51 days or more of income in cash, again, did not become financially distressed. So again, this is not some magical number that says, hey, if I have 50 days or now 13.8%, now all of a sudden I'm financially distressed. That's not what we're trying to convey. There's definitely a direct correlation between having sufficient cash and what we would deem to be financially healthy or not financially distressed. Again, we're going to go back and jump into the business world. This was a Dun & Bradstreet study back in 2010 that asked the question, why are these businesses closing? We got to learn from this. And so I think we as ministry leaders can learn from this as well. These were the top 5 reasons of what was identified as the reasons for businesses closing. Poor management, leadership, 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 key. It is, regardless of how strong your financial policies are, investment policy, no matter what policies you have in place, poor leadership can destroy that. So poor leadership. But I'd like for us to just kind of really highlight those the 2 of the 5, cash flow problem and inadequate financial capacity. And again, it has to do with your ability to manage on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis of what's coming in, how much you're spending, and what do you have available in terms of financial capacity to endure through these challenging times. So the question was asked to ministry leaders, 2010 in Outreach Magazine. Question asked, what are you going to do? And 65% said that they're going to begin relying more on volunteers instead of additional paid staff. 45%, they're going to begin more financial training classes, equipping their constituents, their donors, their congregation members. More electronic giving, 41%. But again, I like to highlight 39%. Again, it builds the case. 39% of these ministries said that they're going to start trying to build more financial cushion for their church in the bank account. So let's go on with our second poll question. Question is, approximately how many months of operating expenses do you currently have in reserves? So again, just a quick calculation, 0 to 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7+ months. Let's take a couple of seconds for these results. Again, we had well over 70% saying that they actually had reserves. Okay, so let's take a look at the results and see what this looks like. Okay, so 83% looking at 0 to 3 months, and so obviously those 70+% of you that actually indicated you had reserves, you feel as though you probably don't have enough, thus, or maybe wanting to be affirmed that, boy, this is exactly what we need. 4 to 6, 13%, and 7+ at 4%. So hopefully I've built the case of why liquidity and building cash reserves are so important. Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you, and if you could help walk us through how do we get there? What's the journey, and what does that look like?
Thanks, David. Very good to be with you today. Where I want to first start, though, before we actually talk about the components of cash reserves, I want to talk about a tension that exists in our ministries, and that is a natural, healthy tension between faith and planning. On one side, we know and believe that God is sovereign and His plan will be accomplished. But at the same time, God uses us to be a part of His plan, and we are to be responsible, or what I like to call a shrewd steward in accomplishing His plan. The tension even shows up in our ministries where you may have some who are more visionary and just want to move forward, possibly without counting all the costs. And then there are others in the ministry, many of us that are probably on this call, who tend to actually want to have everything in place before we move forward. This causes tension within our ministries, but it's important to understand that both of these perspectives are important and are healthy in our ministries. So, we work with a lot of different ministries, and sometimes misapplication of biblical principles that God is sovereign and that He will provide can lead some to set aside little or no reserves. Doing so ignores the biblical admonition of our responsibility to plan and set aside resources for lean times, kind of as Jim has already alluded to earlier. So again, there's a healthy tension between these two biblical truths. Jim, from your ministry experience, can you speak about this reality of this tension?
Well, I think it is very, very real, Mark, and changing the culture is absolutely essential when it comes to financial planning. Our pastors are visionary leaders, and they are fantastic, but they don't always live in the financial world. So they oftentimes will think of a budget as something that is a task. It's something that's created. It's unpleasant for them, and we get it done and we want to sit it on a shelf and forget about it until the next year. We need to help them see the importance of the cash flow planning, and that it's essential to our organizations. We want to move from that tension into helping them understand that the financial plan is hopefully God's financial plan for ministry for a coming year or two, depending on your cycles of budgeting. We want them to understand that it's not man's plans for our organizations, but it's God's plan. So we need to seek Him. We need to pray about it. We need to have wise counsel and wisdom through every step of a process of financial planning.
Very helpful, Jim. I love your statement about you need to change the culture, and I know so many times when you have senior leaders, they tend to be visionary, and they have great ideas and great things that they want to accomplish, and yet we also have to make sure that we've got the resources in place to help accomplish that. So there is that tension that is there, but it's a healthy tension. So the first thing is we want to make sure you understand that there is this tension, and that's a healthy thing. Well, as we get into now the nuts and bolts of actually figuring out how much is enough, I'm going to take you kind of through a methodology that we've identified is a best practice for ministries to go through. So the first is to take a look at cash flow fluctuation. Why do we need reserves? The first item is cash flow fluctuation. We're going to unpack each of these in more detail, so we'll go back into that. So the first is cash flow fluctuation. The second item that why we need to have cash reserves is for unplanned events or expenses that occur. We've already talked a little bit about the surprises that happen to all of us. So we need to have money set aside for that. And the third item that we need to have money set aside for is for potential ministry opportunities. And this is the fun side of things, where God is working and wants to use us to accomplish His plan, but we need to have some money set aside so that we can act upon those plans as God reveals them to us. So let's start to unpack this. Let's start with cash flow fluctuation. We all know that revenues don't always come in at the same time that expenses occur. And so we need to have some extra cash to cover that duration of time that we have spending that's greater than our income. And in most ministries, we actually have an annual cash flow fluctuation cycle that occurs, and I'm going to show you on this next slide here. This is a very typical cash balance. We were just looking at our cash balances in a ministry. This is very typical. As you can see, at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, you have the high point, and then on this slide here, you can see about October, November-ish time frame is where you have the low point of the year. So we've got a high point and a low point, and so what we need to have some cash reserves set aside for is that that variation that occurs between those 2 points in time, and that duration of time that we need to have cash set aside for. So that's the first thing that we need to make sure that we do. And what we suggest as we work with ministries is that they figure out what that variation is each year by taking a look at historical views over the last few years, and then actually adding a margin to what you've seen in the past, depending on how fast you're growing, adding a margin to that so that you can have that set aside for the future. Well, the second thing that we want to make sure that we have funds set aside for is unplanned events or expenses. We all know that things happen that we haven't planned, and so we need to make sure that we've got money set aside for things that might occur in our ministries, so that, again, it doesn't take our focus off of the mission that we are called to do. So we need to have some extra cash set aside. So how do you do that? How do you figure that part out? Well, one of the things that we suggest is take a look at the risks in your ministry. And a lot of times the past is a good predictor of what might occur in the future. So what we suggest is that you sit down with your leadership team and you actually go through a process by which you identify those risks and identify the most likely risks that will occur. And so as you've identified those risks, as you see on this screen here, you can see a listing of 5 items, and your ministry may have many more than that, but this is just a short list. But you identify what would be the fiscal impact if that risk or if that unplanned event occurred, and then you begin to identify what is the likelihood. Is it a high likelihood? Is it a low likelihood? The first item there, you have the senior pastor leaving. Well, if you think your senior pastor or your senior leader is not going to be leaving, that's probably not a high likelihood, but the potential is still there. So basically the way this works is we would take the fiscal impact and multiply it times the probability or the likelihood and come up with a target amount for that particular item. And then when we add all of these items up, we get a number that would make sense for our ministry to have set aside. We know that not all of these unplanned events are going to happen at the same time. So we don't need to have all the money set aside, but we do need to have some of the money set aside. So Jim, maybe I can have you talk a little bit in your ministry about this area of unplanned events and how you've approached that.
Sure. We've been resonating with several of these items. We had lost a senior pastor about 18 months or a little longer ago, and that was unexpected. So then we have faced with that, but luckily the Lord has blessed us. We then lost an executive pastor who decided to resign in that transitional period as well. I think that you've got to plan prudently for those things. The other thing, in emergencies happening, we oftentimes don't look at insurances. We don't keep up with our needs for replacement costs and things like that. Sometimes we have long capital projects, construction projects that always seem to drag on a little longer than originally intended, and that creates a donor fatigue. And we want to be sure that we're not having to constantly go back to our people and ask them for more and more money. They expect us to be prudent planners. They expect us to be good stewards and to anticipate as best as possible some of these unplanned events.
Interesting, Jim. I love your ideas there, and the whole idea of like a senior leader leaving, it does have an impact potentially on the income and expense, and so we really need to look at both sides of items and make sure that we've got things taken care of for both income that's being potentially compromised or expenses that occur that we didn't expect. So the next area is potential opportunities. And again, this is where God may be leading you somewhere that maybe it wasn't on your plan for this year. It's not in your budget this year. But we want to be able to have some money set aside to be able to act upon those things that God might put in our lap, so to speak, and pursue. And many times in order to act on those opportunities, we need to have some cash to be able to actually execute on that opportunity before we have time to raise some of those funds that we think we might be able to do. So again, we would suggest that what you want to do is sit down with your leadership team and talk to them about what are some of their dreams, what are some of the things that they believe God is calling them to, but it may not be in the budget this year, it may not be something that we've got money set aside. But let's take maybe a ministry program as an example. If you have that perfect person that could run that ministry just become available, and they're on the job market and you would love to be able to hire them, but it's not in the budget this year. If you've got some money set aside in your cash reserves, maybe you could actually execute and hire that person and start that new ministry that you've wanted to do, and then work on the part of being able to actually raise the funds to be able to do that. So, there's a lot of things that might be out there that God might want you to do. We all have disasters that happen around us, and depending on where you live in the country, you might have tornadoes, or maybe it's a hurricane, or in some parts of the country in the wintertime you have to think about, are we going to be able to have service this week if you're a church because of snow or bad weather. So having money set aside for other potential opportunities where you might be able to actually minister to your community or the communities around you, what a wonderful way to be able to leverage the ministry of your church at times like that. Jim, could you share about some opportunities that your church has been able to jump on as a result of having some money set aside for these types of opportunities?
Sure. It seems like year after year, as I prepare the budget, there is a laundry list of things that have to be cut, and knowing how to prioritize those and put them into the strategies of the church are critical, so that when funds are available or when there's enough surplus from reserves that we can attack those things. For us, it seemed like year after year, we wanted somebody to minister to post-college adults. So those young, in transition singles, and we could never really find the dollars to bring somebody on. You know, video has become a more and more important part of what we do on Sunday mornings. And videography is another area that has been difficult to find the necessary funds or to train up the volunteers to take that on. But I love the fact that we're also thinking about areas such as quick mobilization. Yesterday, a team from EB Free just came back from Japan, from serving there doing tsunami relief. We've been able to act quickly to send people to New Orleans post-Katrina to do work there, and even to be first responders in Haiti. So you really need to think through. There's never a short list of potential possibilities. There's always ministry that needs to be done.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'd love to hear those stories about being able to do things where we're helping the less fortunate of the world, and being able to be Jesus's hands and feet around the world as we do those kinds of things. So again, an important component of why we need to have some money set aside in cash reserves. So as I kind of wrap up this area here, what we want to do is we want to figure out how much money we need to have set aside for cash flow fluctuation. We need to make sure that we have money set aside for those unplanned events that we've identified that potentially could occur, and then have some money set aside for potential opportunities. And when we walk through this process, when we add those three components together, that becomes our unique operating reserves balance target that we should have set aside for our ministry. And our ministry is different than the next ministry. So what we have set aside is going to be potentially different than what another ministry has set aside. But it's based on our ministry and what we're trying to accomplish. One of the things I heard recently that I loved was a quote, and it was a quote I heard. It said, "No margin equals no mission." And the idea there was, if you don't have extra money set aside, you actually can't accomplish your ministry, your mission of your organization. Well, there's a number of things that we've worked on here at ECCU, and one of the things that we've done is work on an actual calculator to help ministries work through this process. And what I have on the screen right now is one of the summary pages. There's a number of other pages that leads up to this, but I'm just showing the summary page here. And at the very top of the page here, if you can make it out there, you can see that we've identified the three different components of cash reserves, and it comes up to a total. And when we sit down with ministries, we actually work through a consultation to help them begin the process of doing that. And so we've done this a lot, and we've got a tool that I think David's even going to allude to in a little bit, of something that if you're interested, we can sit down with you and help you work through how much is enough for your ministry, and give you something that will give you a way in which you can communicate to your staff and to your leadership team in terms of how much is enough. And a lot of times what I see in working with ministries is you've got some of your senior leadership team that when they see these large balances of cash, they're like, my gosh, we should spend that money. And yet, if we can actually work through a process by helping them show them these three different components, you can actually get them on board and get them on your team in terms of saying, yes, I see why we need to have that money set aside, because that's prudent, that's important for us to do. I think Jim talked about that a little bit earlier in terms of changing the culture. So this kind of tool really helps us do that. Well, again, just to reiterate what David alluded to earlier, was we want to make sure that when we're talking about cash reserves or operating reserves again, that we don't include those donor restricted fund balances that the donors have given to us. We need to make sure that that is set aside. In addition to that, again, as David alluded to, we want to make sure that those replacement reserves for those capital items of our campuses, of our properties, are not included, because those need to be set aside for replacement of those capital items. And speaking of that, we also have another tool that you might be interested in. I think it's going to be on one of the landing pages that you've sent out, so you'll actually be able to download this if you want. But it's an important thing for every ministry to work through, and that is actually identifying all of the different items that you're going to have to replace at some point in time on your campus. And each one of those items has a useful life, and it has a remaining life as well. And you can identify what the replacement cost in today's dollars is, and this tool will actually help you calculate how much you should have set aside today in order to pay for that item in the future when it needs to be replaced. And so it gives you, again, an idea of how much you need to have set aside for replacing those physical items on your campus. Well, David, I think I'm done here. I'm going to hand it back over to you. I know there's probably lots of questions that have been coming in, so you certainly want to take some time to answer those.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark, and Pastor Jim. Thank you for your tremendous insight into I think a very difficult and yet a very necessary topic. You know, before I jump into actually some of the questions, I wanted to give some feedback actually to our simulcast locations there in Orange County. The first poll question was talking about how many of you actually have reserves. 90% of you said that you actually do have reserves, but out of that 90%, 70% of you said you had reserves that represented about 0 to 3 months, and then the remaining 30% at 4 to 6 months. So to give you a little perspective there, out of our Texas, a Dallas simulcast, 75% of you there indicated, and it seems very consistent in north of 75% of you said that you have actually reserves in the 0 to 3 months. 17% have between 4 to 6 months, and 8% actually at 7+ months. So just wanted to give you a little bit of feedback on those two poll questions that we had. So diving into some of the questions I think that continue to come in, let me ask both of you, since both of you do live in the ministry world, Mark, for you as well, and let me ask you, Jim, first. You know, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard? We know it's important. I think just by those represented indicate that it's important, but why is it so difficult to build those cash reserves?
Well, I think that particularly in the ministry context, we're all about people and kingdom impact, and large piles of cash are often seen as a target. If it's not being used for ministry, it's going to create tension. So we need to be sure that we have a good context for why it's important. We need to be sure that we're communicating the need in a clear way. You know, sometimes people just don't understand the cost of a replacement of a roof on a building as large as a church, or they know a context of how much it costs to carpet their home, but not their sanctuary. And those dollars are oftentimes a lot larger than the world that people live in their personal lives. So helping them with the context and understanding the value is critical in that process.
How about for you, Mark?
Well, David, I think that we live in a culture where, you know, we're almost, you spend everything you get. And we do a lot of, hopefully, stewardship training at our churches as well for our congregations and other folks in our ministry. And we try to help them understand that we're just a steward of what God has provided with us. And part of that stewardship is actually putting some money aside. So one of the things I think is hard for ministries is there's a sense that we should have a budget that is balanced at the bottom line, so it should be zero net income. And that is a problematic, I think, position to take, because if we spend everything that we get in, there isn't anything set aside. So I think part of this is having to change our thinking in terms of what's appropriate, is actually building into our budgets an actual contingency or an actual line item that says we're going to put money aside for savings, because that's important for us to do. That's a biblical mandate that we have.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, Mark, and it just kind of stirs my head a little bit, because that's one of the things that even at our church we've been really putting an emphasis on is, we're thinking about trying to go out and get some debt. And I challenged our board, and I said, hey, if we think we could get debt, let's pretend as though we have debt. And so we actually built a 10% several years back ago into the budget just to set aside mortgage payments. Well, after the year, we had some cash sitting there unrestricted from the margin that we created. And today we're setting aside 26% of our budget for this potential debt that we think we could do. And it was quite relieving in some respect to be able to look back and say we have now significant cash, and yet we were able to still do more ministry than ever before. So those are great practical tips, I think, that both of you have just kind of alluded to. You talk both a lot about communication, because I think that's really the key here. How much of this information do you communicate to your congregation or to your donor base? And in what form do you do it? How often do you do it? Let me ask both of you. Jim.
Well, we're reporting to boards on a monthly basis and to our congregation quarterly the entire financial picture of our organization. Beyond that, weekly we are communicating income, expenses, and so that our congregation can see how we're doing month to month, whether we're on track or whether we're falling behind, or as in this past year where we've been ahead. But there's always a tension of how much to communicate, because people then start to think that things are going so well we don't need to support the church as well as we have been, or maybe we'll divert some of those dollars to help mission organizations or other causes. So making sure that we're clearly helping them see what's been accomplished in the ministry because of their partnership, understanding the vision going forward, those are some critical things that we need to be communicating.
I know for our church and with ministries that I work with, one of the things that I think is really critical is helping people understand what this cash is there for. Because a lot of times if they see your financial statements or your reports, they see this cash balance, and it looks like to them like a big pile of money, and it's like, oh my gosh, you guys have a lot of money. And so helping people understand from a given perspective or context is really important. So one of the things we do is we present that in terms of how many days could we exist as an organization, rather than just see a dollar amount. So can we exist for 60 days or 90 days because of the cash we have set aside? That again brings some context to it. The other thing that I think is important and helpful is help people see that broken down, just as we talked about today. How much money do we need to have set aside for cash flow fluctuation? If people understand that that's a normal cycle for us, then they're okay with that money sitting there because they know that that's what it's there for. For unplanned events that we have that we don't know what might happen, but we've got it set aside for that, and that we've got money set aside for potential opportunities. If people see that in the context, people don't have such an issue with the money that's sitting there. So I think that's an important component of the communication.
I mean, both of you hit on, I think, the concept of just transparency. Transparency within the leadership to communicate, hey, we have nothing to hide. In fact, we want to tell you what you need to know to help you get comfortable with what we're doing in terms of the ministry. Great feedback. A question that keeps coming up, and it's a very consistent one. I'm going to try to summarize this a little bit. There's a perspective by a lead pastor. He says, if we need it, we can take out a loan. Right? So this concept continues to come up. Well, what if we have a line of credit? Or maybe we could just go out and get a line of credit to bridge us during this time. Mark, been doing this banking thing for 25 years. Any perspective on your part in terms of borrowing for that cash reserve?
Well, Good question. And if using a line of credit is not a bad idea to consider, but it's important to understand what it should be used for and what it should not be used for. In the way that we've described this, the three components, the only portion that really a line of credit should be used for is that cash flow fluctuation part. Because most lines of credit have what is called an evergreen principle or evergreen clause, meaning that it has to be paid off in full for at least 30 to 60 to 90 days every year. So it's really there for just for that cash flow fluctuation part where you have a cyclical cash flow issue. It should not be used for the unplanned events or for the potential opportunities. That really you need to have cash set aside for those components. So if you have one, you can use it for that. I will tell you in today's environment, it is much more difficult and much more, the requirements are much more stringent in order to even get a line of credit. So, you know, it's certainly available to some, but it's not as used as much as it was maybe 5 years ago.
Absolutely. I concur with you as well, Mark. It is not as easy to obtain new financing just to bridge the cash reserves. The qualifications, the criteria are definitely a lot higher. We have about 3 minutes here, and we want to be honoring of everyone's time. Let me ask one more question. And Pastor Jim, this is probably one that I think a lot of ministries struggle with. How do you protect the reserves? That's the finance people. How do you protect the reserves and say no to ministry requests?
Probably one of the most difficult questions we can answer, but I think it starts with relationship. Yeah. You have to have a really good relationship with your staff. We need to help people understand the context. We need to help them understand the reasoning for the reserves. And we need to do that in simple terms. We want our ministry leaders to be visionary, kingdom-minded, godly people. And they don't, in that context, always understand the financial aspects and that there's cost associated with ministry and running their organization. So we need to find ways to help them understand those simply. You know, today is absolutely a great start. People will always tend to kind of take a negative response to things that they don't fully understand or that go against the directions that they think their organization should go. And so if we have good relationships with our boards, with our ministry leaders, that's a free give and take with transparency, they will begin to understand why every once in a while we have to say no. Yeah. But we always want to do it in the context of knowing that any way that we can say yes to advance the kingdom, that's the goal.
Yeah. Well, in about 30 seconds, Mark. Again, 30 seconds. What's that magic number, real quick, so that everybody can know? Are you there, Mark?
Yes, sorry. Yes, we get asked that question quite often, and again, if you go through this process, that will build the best dollar amount that you should have. But for a church, ballpark numbers that probably would come up would be somewhere in the 60 to 90 days of expenses would be a ballpark idea. For a parachurch organization on the other side of the spectrum, is probably somewhere around 120 to 180 days of expenses, and Christian schools are somewhere in the middle there between those two spectrums.
Okay. Well, I know, like I said, we want to be honoring of the time, and as I mentioned earlier, questions continues to come up regarding the slides and the presentations, and so we'll be emailing each of you a link with a recording of this webinar, and actually you're going to be receiving 2 emails. The first will connect you with the presentation slides and the other resources from today's webinar, and then the second email is going to link you to the webinar recording itself for you to listen to it again if you need to. And in the meantime, here are a few additional resources that may be of interest to you. There's a white paper that's available, and we have a continuous blog that's going on our website as well. Also, ECC staff are available to actually walk you through this consultation. And the beauty part of this is free. For those who are in the simulcast, those MDOs are available to walk you through this calculation of what is unique to your particular ministry in terms of what that number is for cash reserves. And so that's readily available to anybody here on the webinar. So please contact us if you have any desire to go through that process. We also, at the credit union, are wanting to equip you, each of you. So we actually have an upcoming budgeting webinar. In August, we're going to be offering 2 tracks, and you can choose which one that best fits your ministry, Budgeting 101 to Advanced Budgeting. So for more information, you can go ahead and click on our website there. Again, thank you, Jim. Thanks, Mark. And thanks to all of you.
Great to be with you.
Thanks to both of you, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. And like I said, be sure to look out for the emails I mentioned earlier. And again, if you want to engage in any of those tools free of charge, please contact any at ECCU at either the phone number up there or the email. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you again for attending, and Lord's blessings to each and every one of you. Bye-bye.